trigger is when something happens and our body, our nervous system is responding with a memory of how stressed, fearful, anxious we felt at the time, but that was repressed. That energy stays in our body. And when we're triggered, it arises. And that causes us to have emotional responses and dysregulation. So it can cause emotions to come up, which then ignite trails of thought that make our behaviors and our physical displays difficult to manage. And it can cause a cycle of dysregulation, where we're not in control of ourselves and our body, our mind, our emotions have taken over, and we are then just involved in all of this response and action. Triggers only come from unhealed trauma wounds. When we process these wounds and when we learn the skills that we need in order to regulate and release and process our emotions in healthy ways, we aren't triggered as often. And we're not as scared about triggers, which is then another layer of fear that might arise with it all. Before we can speak and talk about what's going on for us, our emotional expression, very often we communicate that with our body, because that's how we first learned to express our emotions when we couldn't speak as infants. We had this emotional response and we cried. We wailed our arms, we had a tantrum and kicked, and we couldn't express ourselves. We expressed it physically. And when we ignite in these trauma wounds and being triggered, so the memory of that feeling is coming up, very often our body wants to communicate and it's responding in the same sort of way as we would have as emotional children. When we're doing inner child work, we are working with the most vulnerable parts of ourselves, with our most vulnerable experiences, and we can retract back really easily into this way of communicating. It's like a primal response. There's nothing wrong with it. We're not doing anything wrong. It's not stupid or irrational or any of those stories we might be telling ourselves, which is all part of the reparenting work, by the way, to get rid of those stories. It's completely natural. It's completely understandable, and it's part of the process. Because each time we're triggered and we have those responses, we're learning. It's a learning experience. We're learning what our body wants to do, how we're feeling, and what caused that response. And we use that data, we use that information to then heal the wound by reparenting ourselves. But when we do the inner child work, we are essentially bringing all that up intentionally. And especially if our inner child has been repressed for a long time, especially the rebellious aspect of our inner child, or even the vulnerable one, these emotions can come up quite strongly, and we can be tested in a way by those parts of our psyche that actually doesn't trust us. So that part of who our thought process, our mind body system, doesn't trust us to allow that expression to happen. So the expression might even come up in situations that we don't expect. And that can be awful as an adult, right? Nobody wants to just suddenly overreact and have this emotional outburst, but it's all part of the learning. It's all part of building trust with our inner child. When we learn skills such as emotional regulation through breath work, self-inquiry skills, negotiating skills to find new ways of coping and adapting, when we bring these skills together, this is how we move through the work. This is how we re-regulate ourselves. And this is how we build trust with the inner child. Because once the inner child trusts us to reparent ourselves and to provide a safe environment, a healthy environment to express their emotions, the triggers ease. Especially then once we are addressing what caused the trauma in the first place, acknowledging it, validating it. It's so important to heal in that aspect of ourselves. And all of those emotions, the energy and the triggers can then be released. And we can put strategies in place as adults to manage that. And it might mean that we have to make changes in our environment. It might mean that we have to work, live, respond in different ways. And that's all part of the reparenting process.